Before we jump into our textbook, I always like to start off with thinking about what media and politics really are, and then also go through a brief history about news distribution throughout human history. But let's start with, first off, what are politics? So politics, generally defined in poli-sci, it's a discussion of who gets what, when, where, and why. It's a conversation about public policy and who receives it. All right, cool enough. What are media? Media are nothing more than ways to transfer information from one person to another. Now, a medium can be many things. TV is a medium. Internet is a medium. Radio is a medium. Together they are media. One thing I want you to get for sure before you end this class: media are plural. Medium is singular. All right, now, what are news? Or what is news, rather? News, what we tend to think about. Why do we read the things that we do? Why do we hear the things that we do? What makes news news? Generally, we like to think of two specific things. First one, it has to be new. Go figure, it's in the title. So news has to be new, and generally speaking, it has to be surprising. If news isn't surprising, then do we really care to hear it? So new and surprising are two things that we think news stories should have. And we'll talk more about that throughout the semester. Now, comparative politics, because the class is Media and Politics in Comparative Perspective. So what does that mean, comparative perspective? It means taking one thing and looking at it from multiple different angles. That's it. So in this class, one of the big things that we are really going to discuss is the relationship between media and politics and media. Which one influences the other more? Or is it they're equal? You know, it's an important question we need to think about. And we're going to be looking around the world at some 200 or so different places. So it's likely we'll have to use multiple perspectives in order to really get an idea of what's going on in the world today. So let's take a look at some of the history about media, and not so much about politics yet, but just the evolution of media over time. So let's look at prehistory. So here we're thinking beginning of human beings to about 3000 BC. All right, so about 5,000 years ago and before. What was media like back then? What was the medium of choice at the time? Well, before 3000 BC, we don't really have written records. So it's not necessarily that written records didn't exist. However, we just figured this is somewhere around the time where writing did start. But before then, how did people get their news? Oral communication. Word of mouth. Generally speaking, ancient trade routes like the Silk Road and other routes across Europe and Africa, people got their news via trade. When you would trade with someone, you would talk to them, tell them what's been going on, and then they would pass it on to the next person they saw. So for the vast majority of human history, oral communication was the way. Now, 3000 BC to 500 AD, we see written word comes along. Now, is this a big deal? Is this revolutionary as far as the evolution of media? Short answer is yes. Because how many of us have played that game where you sit in a classroom, teacher tells one person a single sentence, and they have to pass it on from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. And by the end, the very last person, what happens whenever they say that one sentence? It's something completely different. See, that's the thing about media and what we know about prehistory. Not very much, because news at that time was at best unreliable, and more than likely in many cases was completely false. Okay? Written word coming around 5,000 years ago, though, now you could see the news. You didn't have to hope that one person was telling you every single detail correctly. You could read it for yourself. Although arguably, oral communication is still the most important form of news during this entire time period. Why might that be the case? Literacy. Literacy rates. For the vast majority of human history, even after written word was a thing, from 3000 BC to 500 AD, most people did not know how to read. Learning how to read and being educated was something for the high upper class, the elites. And at this point in human history, the vast majority of people did not fall into that category. And thereby, even though written word came around, oral communication still is arguably the most important form of communication and media all the way up until 500 AD. So now we're into modern history, 6th century to the 15th century and past. Really, we're thinking about 500 AD to all the way in the 1800s. Now, at this time period, two very specific differently time periods, 16th century slash 15th century, in two very different places, China and Europe, a new medium arrives on the scene, the printing press. So in 6th century BC, or rather 6th century AD, you have Chinese monks where we have found evidence and manuscripts that they created a printing press. And they were the first ones to do so. Now, independent of that, in the 1400s, in Europe, the printing press was also invented. But, as you can see, a long time afterward. Alright, so regardless of the argument who did what first, the point is, the printing press came about. Now, is this a big deal? Is this revolutionary or a modification of a previous medium? So at first, remember too, these printing presses, they were not the mass circulation printing presses that we think about for the most part. These tasks were time-consuming. Printing a manuscript or anything took more time. Okay, so they weren't pumping out books in large volume. Right? They were doing it slowly. But the reason why that's important is because they were still doing it faster than someone just copying something and handing it out to someone, like a written word would be. So what we start to see is, over time, the development of an education system around the world. Now, this is important when we think about the last question. Does it overtake oral communication as most important news medium? No, it does not, because even well into the 1800s, most people still don't know how to read. So oral communication is still by far the most important medium in this time period as well. But what do you need to have in order to learn how to read? Books, written literature. The printing press made more printed material available for people to learn how to read. As a byproduct, it was in this era after the printing press all around the world that we started to see literacy come up, and the written word started becoming more and more important. However, though, remember, oral communication is still the most important medium at this point in time in history. Now we come to the Industrial Revolution era. And in 1895, an Italian inventor named Marconi creates the radio. Now, right away we're going to ask again, is this revolutionary in the evolution of media and news distribution? Yes, 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 and yes. But why? Well, for one, you could actually hear the news from a source. And hear the news. Not just like your friend telling you what's going on with the day, but you could have a reliable or theoretically reliable source telling you and thousands upon thousands, even millions of people at the same time what's going on. Also, quickly. This, for the first time, really sped up the distribution of news like never seen before in the world. Radio combined also with the telegraph, combined with cables that went underwater and connected different continents. This is the era where we started seeing technology grow to connect the world as far as the distribution of news like we had never seen before on Earth. So yes, this was definitely a massive advancement as far as media and politics and the distribution of news. But then we come back. Does this medium overtake oral communication as the most important form of spreading the news? One part of the answer is yes, it does. And mostly because radio is a form of oral communication. However, the oral communication generally in the past before this was a two-way streak between multiple different people. This way, radio, at least at first, before telephones and whatnot, radio was from broadcaster to consumer, and that was it, right? So this is important for other reasons as well, besides it's extremely fast. People can actually, though, hear tones in your voice. And whenever I say it's an auditory medium, remember before it was just your friends, talking to your friends, talking to your family, talking to business people. But now you're listening to someone else's voice, someone that you don't know. And it makes you wonder, does the medium you consume news through affect how you perceive the news? Can someone's voice and the way they choose to speak invoke emotion in you and create an emotional response to the news you are listening to? This becomes really, really important whenever we get to our midway point in the semester, whenever we start to think about traditional media versus digital media and some of the major differences. And it becomes extremely important too when we jump next to our next piece of media evolution. In 1925, we get the television. This is 30 years after the invention of the radio, after a new revolutionary form of media comes out. And is this new medium just as revolutionary? No, it's even more revolutionary. How so, you may ask? Well, so much so that television has taken over radio as being the dominant medium in most countries in the world. Now, there are many countries still out there, and some of you may choose it for your research paper, that are lower on the economic development scale. And in these countries, radio still remains the most dominant medium of choice. However, television has, generally speaking, taken that dominant role away from radio and oral communication. So much so that even whenever we come to 1989 and the invention of the World Wide Web and the Internet has not taken over television's role as dominant medium. Even in the US, more people get their news today from television than from internet. Now, is that changing? Slowly. And we'll talk about that more in the second half of the semester with the digital media textbook. But for right now, TV is still the dominant order. Now, that being said, the internet. Is the internet revolutionary? Of course it is. Okay? The internet does something no other medium before it did. It takes all of the media before it and puts it together. You can listen to radio shows, you can read different manuscripts, you could read newspapers, you can watch television, all on the internet. And the internet connects the distribution of news around the world faster than we've seen ever before as well. So yes, the internet is definitely huge. It's definitely a big deal. It's definitely revolutionary. But it hasn't taken over as the dominant medium yet, and part of that is because of the digital divide, which we'll talk about moving on in the second half of the semester. Now let's take an overview of the timeline we've looked at so far. So the dominant medium for the vast majority of human civilization and before, oral communication. For tens of thousands of years, this is the way people got their news. And still today. You ask a lot of people, how do you get your news? Well, I talked to a friend told me, a friend texted me, or regardless, but still friends, okay? And the oral communication and transmission of words from one person to another still happens all the time, right? For the past 5,000 years, so really recent in all of human history, we have written word. Newspapers comes even further, about 1200 to 500 years ago, before we had newspapers. Mass circulation printing presses we only have had for the past 200 years or so. Radio has been around for 125 years. Television has been around for 95 years. The internet has been around for about 30 years. Alright, so that's the timeline of media evolution, of the technology for the way that we distribute news around the world. Some important questions we want to think about moving forward. Does the type of medium a person consumes matter for the quality of news they receive? The short answer is yes, it most certainly does. We will look at, though, the variables that determine how and when and where it affects it. Now, what are some of the implications of media evolution from this timeline that we've just given? One of the biggest implications that should jump out of you is that The internet has only been around for 30 years in comparison to TV's been around for 95 years, radio's been around for 125 years, newspapers and printing presses have been around for 1,000 years, written word even longer. That should tell you that where we are in media evolution today in the distribution of news, we are still figuring things out as far as how the internet works. All right, very much so. And then another question that we should really think about: are digital media really revolutionary for humanity consuming news? Now, this gets to the very heart of the initial relationship we were talking about. Do media affect politics, or do politics affect media? Because if politics affect media, then the internet isn't going to revolutionarily make the world free. Now, if media affects politics, then perhaps what the tech companies sell, that technology and the internet will eventually free the world, perhaps that can take place. But part of what we are really thinking about throughout this entire semester is this question: are digital media really revolutionary? And which one is more? Do media affect politics, or do politics affect media?